Flamethrowers, kamikaze attacks, banzai charges, and nuclear weapons. In World War II, the Pacific Campaign had a certain brutality to it that deserves some particular recognition. Often overshadowed by the larger European campaign, many details of the Pacific theater are often overlooked. Here is the entire Pacific Campaign, explained as simply as possible. The start of the conflict in the Pacific can be traced all the way back to the 1920s and 1930s when Japan and China squabbled over raw materials and railway rights in eastern China. Around this time, the Chinese government was fractured between the communist and nationalist parties. Meanwhile, Japan was undergoing a national movement to rally behind Emperor Hirohito and expand what they believed to be their glorious empire. Japan was able to exploit the Chinese infighting and managed to take control of a large region in eastern China. Eventually, the Chinese communists and nationalists had no choice but to unite and attempt to push back the invading Japanese. Japanese forces were still able to push deeper and deeper into China until they took the capital city of Nanjing, where the infamous Nanjing Massacre took place in 1937. Most historians agree that about 200,000 Chinese were killed in this massacre. The Japanese greatly damaged their reputation on the world stage with these actions, but at this point they were too deep and had to commit. With no other choice, the Japanese pushed farther into northern China until they started getting close to some territories controlled by the Soviet Union. The Japanese ran out of luck when Soviet and Mongolian forces teamed up and put a stop to the northern leg of the Japanese invasion. After reevaluating their options and occupying China for a few years, Japan decided to invade French Indochina to the south in 1940. It was this same year that Japan joined the Axis powers. Japan hoped that joining the Axis would aid their imperialistic ambitions. Japan achieved mixed results while fighting in southern China until a Chinese counteroffensive was launched, at which point the Japanese implemented increasingly harsh tactics that resulted in roughly 2.7 million Chinese civilian casualties. The war would go on to become a stalemate between Japan and China for several years. While all this was happening, Western powers like the United States, Britain, and Australia grew increasingly upset with Japan and its imperialistic tendencies. These Western countries agreed to stop selling oil, iron, and steel to Japan in an effort to discourage Japanese aggression. Without these Western imports, the Japanese economy would be at risk of a full-scale crash. In retaliation, the Japanese started planning acts of aggression against the West as early as 1941. Japan's plan was to take control of European and American territories around Indonesia and Australia that could help offset the economic losses from the Western embargoes. Japan knew that these acts might draw the United States into the war, so the Japanese decided to also take the Philippines, Wake Island, and Guam, all United States territories, before the U.S. could officially become part of the war. The Japanese didn't actually expect to win the war once the United States became involved, but they hoped to at least be able to keep most of the land in a later peace treaty. In an effort to cripple United States counterattacks, the Japanese launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor and Honolulu, in which 8 American battleships were disabled or destroyed. Unfortunately for Japan, no American aircraft carriers were at Pearl Harbor, which were the most sought-after targets. Additionally, the United States submarine base, intelligence units, and overall naval building infrastructure were all unharmed during the attack, making the attack on Pearl Harbor not nearly as devastating as the Japanese had hoped. To make matters worse, war had not even been publicly declared on the United States at this time, further ruining Japan's reputation amongst all Western powers. Japan angered the Western world so much, in fact, that the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and the Netherlands all declared war on Japan within 48 hours. Barely 2 months after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the Japanese would also commit the bombing of Darwin, a harbor in northern Australia. Overshadowed by the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the bombing of Darwin ended up being the single largest attack on Australian soil ever committed by a foreign nation. Similar to Pearl Harbor, the Japanese hoped to preemptively cripple Allied naval power before an official response to Japanese aggression could be taken. In early 1942, the Japanese Navy was able to obtain some pretty key victories against Allied naval forces. Japan took several small islands and even enjoyed some success against the British Navy in the Indian Ocean. the Japanese were also able to destroy over half of the United States' air power in the Philippines. The Americans and their Filipino allies continued to suffer losses that culminated in the Bataan Death March in April 1942, in which several thousand American and Filipino prisoners of war were killed. The brutal tactics of the Japanese could already be observed at this point in the war. The Nanjing Massacre, Pearl Harbor, the bombing of Darwin, and the Bataan Death March are all a testament to things the Japanese were willing to do in order to secure more territory for their empire. Ultranationalism is a hell of a drug. Around this time in 1942, Japan also set up blockades around Australia and invaded New Guinea, from which the Japanese could conduct more air raids on northern Australia. It became clear that the Allies would have to work together to stop the Japanese threat for good, so Australian Prime Minister John Curtin agreed to place Australian forces under the command of American General Douglas MacArthur and his comically sized pipe. In 1942, the Pacific War Council was formed by representatives from each nation of the Allied powers. Japan would successfully invade parts of New Guinea, just north of Australia, but the Allies would start to gain ground in the war when this invasion was pushed back 2 days later. This would be a significant setback for the Japanese, as it postponed their advance into the southern Pacific. Things got worse for Japan when America conducted its first air raid against the Japanese mainland. Japan needed to think fast if it wanted to keep its momentum going in the Pacific. Admiral Yamamoto thus came up with the plan to occupy Midway Atoll, a tiny island cluster close to America. With Midway Atoll occupied by the Japanese, Yamamoto hoped that this would cause the Americans to stay in a defensive posture and delay the Americans from getting directly involved in the Pacific. After much calm and respectful debate, the Japanese Navy half committed to the Midway Plan, and Yamamoto was allowed to conduct its operation, but with extremely limited resources. The rest of the Japanese Navy would continue to carry out more operations in New Guinea to further secure the Japanese foothold in the southern Pacific. The operations in New Guinea were unsuccessful due to Japanese resources being spread so thin. General Yamamoto didn't fare any better at Midway, thanks to the efforts of American Navy codebreakers that found out about the Japanese plot. The Japanese Navy was intercepted 700 miles west of the Midway Islands. Japan attempted to still launch bombing runs against the Midway facilities, but these proved to be unsuccessful as well. By the end of the failed operation, Japan's fleet had been severely crippled, and the Japanese were forced to retreat from Midway. Japan's first major land defeat came soon after. Throughout the summer of 1942, Japanese forces continued their attempt to take control of New Guinea, but were repulsed by the Allies. Japanese forces would soon be forced to ease off their New Guinea offensive so they could help defend an important airfield on Guadalcanal, which had become a vital target for the Americans. Allied intelligence agencies became aware of the construction of a Japanese airfield on Guadalcanal, which led the Americans to land over 10,000 Marines on the island in August 1942. The fight for Guadalcanal then became a 6-month-long war of attrition. This battle was one of only 2 instances where American battleships directly engaged with Japanese battleships. A large portion of Japanese aircraft was diverted to Guadalcanal to help with its defense, but many of these aircraft were shot down by American defenses. It is around this time that Japan really started to lose many of its experienced fighter pilots, which greatly reduced the effectiveness of Japanese air power. Eventually, the Japanese lost the war of attrition on Guadalcanal due to the fact that they couldn't properly resupply their troops once they lost their main airfield. This caused the Japanese to abandon Guadalcanal in February 1943. By the end of the fight for Guadalcanal, the Japanese casualties began to far outweigh those of the Americans. This victory on Guadalcanal was exactly what the Allied forces needed in order to begin their aggressive island-hopping campaign to retake the southern Pacific region. To prepare for this campaign, America ramped up its industrial output to produce more ships, planes, and other war materials. Due in large part to the embargoes placed on Japan by Western powers, Japan had no chance at keeping up with the American war economy. Many small islands not recognized in popular media were taken either by air raids, naval bombardments, or brutal amphibious assaults. These attacks by the Americans ramped up to Operation Cartwheel in the summer of 1943, which focused on the recapture of the Solomon Islands as well as the rest of New Guinea. The American attacks were mostly successful, although it became clear very quickly that the Japanese would continue to fight harder and harder as the Allies pushed closer to Japan. Amphibious tactics were refined, and assault plans had to be carefully synchronized with air raids and naval bombardments in order for the Americans to mitigate their own casualties as much as possible. The Cairo Conference occurred in November 1943, where three of the main Allied commanders finalized a plan to defeat the Japanese threat for good. It was at this conference that the Allies established that their ultimate goal would be to strip Japan of the Pacific Islands it had conquered since 1914, as well as all the territory it had taken from China. This would effectively set back the Japanese imperialistic plans by about half a century. As the fighting on the Pacific Islands continued, Japan became increasingly starved of resources due to the naval blockades imposed by the Allied powers. Submarines would frequently sink Japanese supply ships, especially after President Roosevelt declared unrestricted submarine warfare, a military doctrine in which American submarines could indiscriminately sink any Japanese merchant or transport ship it crossed paths with. In particular, Japanese oil tankers were seen as a high-priority target to the Americans. Because of this, Japan's lack of fuel became extremely dire. So dire, in fact, that while planning many battles, Japanese commanders had to factor in the possibility that their forces would have no ability to retreat simply because they would have no fuel for their vehicles. At later points in the war, a significant portion of the Japanese fleet would be stranded wherever they laid anchor due to how bad the Japanese fuel crisis had become. At this point in the war, things were already looking pretty bleak for the Japanese. While taking stock of their losses in the Pacific, Japan looked back toward China and decided to try and offset their losses by taking more Chinese territory. This culminated in Operation Ichigo in April 1944, which had the ultimate goal of connecting Japanese-controlled territories so that a flow of resources could be started anew. 500,000 Japanese troops were committed to Operation Ichigo, and about 100,000 Japanese were lost. While a good amount of ground was gained for Japan during the operation, no significant strategic victories were accomplished. As Japan's war campaign continued to falter, Japanese commanders grew increasingly aware and increasingly nervous about their situation. More operations were developed to try and salvage what remained of their overall war campaign. Operation Z was created in the first half of 1944 to create a defensive perimeter around Pacific Islands that remained under Japanese control. As time went on, Operation Z was modified, and Japan's defensive perimeter continued to shrink. Operation Ego was also created, in which Japanese naval power would be consolidated to one location and go on the offensive against the encroaching American forces. However, before this plan could be fully fleshed out, the Americans launched a new offensive of their own, the seizure of the Marianas Islands. This act was one of the first nails in the coffin for the Japanese, as it would start to officially cripple the Japanese movement of air power to and from the Pacific region. Capturing the Marianas would also allow American B-29 bombers to be stationed close enough to the Japanese home islands that major bombing operations could commence. The fight for the Marianas began on June 15, 1944, when Marines from the 2nd and 4th Divisions landed on Saipan. Marines in this fight began to notice how desperate and fierce the Japanese defenders were starting to become. Nevertheless, the primary objective, Osceola Airfield, was captured in about 3 days, with the rest of the island falling under American control in a few weeks. In a final desperate act, the Japanese carried out a massive banzai charge, which proved to the Americans how hard the Japanese were willing to fight once their homeland started to become threatened. When Saipan came under direct attack by American forces, the Japanese considered it as their sign to launch Operation Ego. Japan deployed its largest group of aircraft carriers all at once. 9 Japanese carriers would clash with 15 American carriers in the Marianas, and the losses for the Japanese would prove to be catastrophic. In an all-in bet, Japan had hoped to put a decisive stop to the American advancement into Japanese territory. To the dismay of the Japanese, however, only 1 American aircraft carrier was even slightly damaged, while Japan lost 3 carriers and over 600 aircraft. By the end of the naval battle in the Marianas, Japan only had enough pilots remaining to constitute an air group for 1 light carrier. A month after Saipan, Guam and Tinian were also captured by American forces. It was from these islands that many air raids against the Japanese homeland were committed, in which several 100,000 Japanese were killed in cities like Osaka, Kobe, and Tokyo. Despite all of these devastating Japanese losses, things did not yet get easier for the Americans, as the next island to be invaded was none other than Peleliu on the 15th of September, 1944. This battle had the highest casualty rate amongst U.S. forces out of all the amphibious operations in the Pacific War. What made this battle so devastating for the Americans was the change in Japanese tactics. The Japanese left the beachhead of Peleliu uncontested and instead focused on fortifying elevated fighting positions in the interior of the island, making for some of the bloodiest fighting of the entire World War. Peleliu was predicted to only take the Americans 4 days to capture, but Japanese resistance on the island didn't end for 2 full months. To make matters worse, the strategic relevance of the island was questioned and remains a key topic of debate to this day. Needless to say, Japan's position at this point in the war was not great. A large portion of their aircraft carriers had been sunk, and the American offensive continued to push closer to Japan itself. The Japanese Navy was not yet completely drained, however. Japan didn't have nearly enough carriers to face the Americans head-on, so the Japanese opted to use their remaining carriers as bait to lure the American carriers away from their stations in the Philippines. With fewer carriers defending the American position, Japan hoped to use its heavy cruisers and battleships to pound the Americans with an intense offshore bombardment, as well as try to sink any remaining transport ships left by the Americans in the Filipino Leyte Gulf. This seemed like a well-devised scheme until the Japanese were surprised by American submarines, which knocked out 3 Japanese cruisers before they could get into position. Some of the remaining Japanese battleships tried to press on with the attack, but were ambushed by a joint American and Australian naval force. The Japanese did manage to pull a couple of American carriers out of position, leaving a few small escort ships undefended, but the loss of these American ships were not enough to make up for the Japanese losses. While the battle for the Leyte Gulf hasn't received much attention in popular media, it would end up being the largest naval battle in World War II, and it's even considered by some historians to be the largest naval battle in all of history. It was also the Japanese Navy's largest ever recorded loss of ships and men in combat. The American victory at the Leyte Gulf allowed America to tighten its grasp on the Philippine region of the Pacific. America continued to push into the Philippines and was able to steadily take more control of the region. Some of the key battles in the Philippines took place on Mindoro and Manila, the latter of which resulted in over 100,000 civilian deaths and had some of the worst urban fighting in the entire theater. A fun fact is that the Mexican Air Force's Squadron 201 took part in this campaign attached to America's 58th Fighter Group. Another fun fact is that the last Japanese soldier to surrender in the Philippines surrendered in 1974, about 30 years after the end of the war. Filipino guerrillas would go on to help American troops dispatch the remaining Japanese resistance throughout the Philippines. The final leg of the Pacific War started with the Allied invasion of Burma, currently Myanmar. This offensive was a particularly diverse multinational effort with units drawn from the United Kingdom, China, America, India, and Africa. The Indian 15th Corps, along with 2 West African divisions, advanced along coastal regions and even landed troops behind the retreating Japanese soldiers to inflict maximum casualties. Meanwhile, American and Chinese forces advanced into northern Burma. As Allied forces captured more of Burma, the Burmese National Army, which had actually been created by the Japanese, began to turn against Japan and helped the Allied cause. As Americans approached the city of Rangoon, American commanders feared the Japanese would resort to deadly house-to-house combat. To the delight of the Americans, however, the Japanese had already evacuated the city. Before the Japanese surrendered the country of Burma, a total of 150,000 Japanese soldiers had been killed. With the capture of a large portion of the southern Pacific, the Americans and their allies seemed poised for sure victory, but a few logistical problems still existed. B-29 bombers were continuing their air raids against the Japanese mainland, but the distance between the Marianas airfields and Japan caused many American bombers to have to bail out at sea when damaged. Halfway between the Marianas and Japan was the small island of Iwo Jima. Capturing Iwo Jima would provide emergency landing stations for bombers and would serve as a base for P-51 Mustang escorts. Unfortunately, the Japanese also recognized Iwo Jima's strategic importance, so networks of bunkers, caves, and hidden passages were constructed in order to prepare the Japanese defense. At this point in the war, the Japanese didn't expect to hold Iwo Jima. Instead, they wanted to incur so many American casualties that the American advance would be slowed and Japan could gain some bargaining power in future negotiations to end the war. A total of 21,000 Japanese troops were deployed to defend Iwo Jima. Before the American landing commenced in February 1945, Iwo Jima was pounded mercilessly with offshore naval bombardments. Japanese defenses were entrenched so deeply, however, that these bombardments did little to soften the resistance for the Marine ground force. 30,000 Marines landed on Iwo Jima, As soon as these Marines pushed to the interior of the island, they came under heavy machine gun and artillery fire, causing 2,000 Marines to be wounded or killed by the end of the first day. Fighting would continue to be fierce on the island. On the fourth day, the famous raising of the flag photo would be taken, which has often been cited as the most reproduced photograph in history and helped shape America's perception of the war, as well as being depicted in a movie directed by Clint Eastwood.
The last time you saw chicken shit, Jim Bob? When you were shaving this morning?
The island of Iwo Jima was not secured until the 26th of March, 1945, over a month after the initial landing. Iwo Jima was an absolutely savage battle, but America wasn't done yet. Arguably the worst battle fought in the Pacific, Okinawa, began on April 1st, 1945. The point of taking Okinawa was that it could serve as a staging area for a direct land-based invasion of Kyushu, one of the 4 main Japanese islands. With so much territory controlled so close to the Japanese mainland, capturing Okinawa would also help implement the final naval blockades America believed would help win the war. Okinawa held nearly 100,000 Japanese defenders, this time largely made up of conscripted civilians. While America would take on the main amphibious assault of Okinawa, the British Pacific Fleet was also involved with the objective of striking airfields on surrounding islands in order to minimize Japanese air support on Okinawa. After landing on the island, Americans faced the first Japanese counterattack. This counterattack, named Operation Tengo, used remaining Japanese carriers as bait to draw portions of the American Navy away from Okinawa. The ships that remained near Okinawa then came under kamikaze attacks that would prove to be lethal but not devastating to the American invasion. American ground forces would take the northern portion of the island in about 2 weeks, but the southern portion of the island proved to be much harder to pacify. On May 29th, Shuri Castle was taken by the Marines, signaling a decisive blow to the Japanese defensive effort. Organized resistance on Okinawa finally ended on June 21st, and the Okinawa operation was considered finished on July 2nd. The complete fall of Okinawa to the Americans took almost 3 months. Over 12,000 Americans gave their lives to take Okinawa. 94% of the Japanese defensive force died while fighting on Okinawa, and Japanese kamikaze attacks killed almost 5,000 American sailors. While all this happened, Japan wasn't faring much better in China. 80,000 Japanese soldiers were mobilized in March 1945 in order to try to seize Chinese airfields in West Hunan. The Chinese responded with 110,000 men, some of which were equipped with American equipment, as well as 400 Chinese and American aircraft. The Chinese repulsed the attacking Japanese and launched a counterattack and then retook Guangxi, the last major Japanese stronghold in southern China. Japan was almost completely defeated by mid-1945. The question remained, how do you make the ferocious Japanese surrender? Battles on Okinawa and Iwo Jima proved that the Japanese would rather endure the nastiest and bloodiest conditions than admit defeat. At this time, the U.S. Navy was in strong favor of imposing a total naval blockade on Japan while simultaneously launching devastating air raids. The rest of the U.S. government wasn't sure if this was the right strategy, but they were sure about one thing. A ground invasion of the Japanese mainland needed to be avoided at all costs. As Americans took control of islands that got progressively closer to Japan, the Japanese fighting style got more and more savage and merciless. Casualties from an invasion of the Japanese mainland were projected to be simply unacceptable. For the time being, America decided to conduct a large amount of traditional air raids on Japan. B-29 firebombing raids were launched, which caused Japan's already struggling industrial production to plummet even further. On March 9, 1945, Operation Meeting House was launched, in which 1,665 tons of bombs were dropped on Tokyo. This was recorded as being the most destructive bombing raid in history and killed nearly 100,000 people in a single night. Over 1 million people were made homeless by the single operation. Operation Starvation was also implemented, in which waterways around Japan were laid with mines in order to disrupt the importation of goods to Japan. In July of 1945, the Potsdam Declaration was introduced by the Allied powers, where the terms of Japanese surrender were outlined. In this declaration, it was stated that if Japan did not surrender, it would face prompt and utter destruction. On August 6, 1945, America unveiled its new weapon, the atomic bomb. The city of Hiroshima was bombed in the first nuclear attack in history. After not immediately surrendering, Japan was again hit with an atomic bomb in the city of Nagasaki. Roughly 200,000 Japanese were killed as a direct result of the two bombs. The necessity of these nuclear bombs is still debated. Some argue that the naval blockades and bombing raids would have caused Japan to eventually surrender. Others argue that the Japanese government was willing to sacrifice its own populace if it meant they could avoid surrendering. Either way, Japan was forced to reevaluate its approach to ending the war when these new weapons of mass destruction were introduced. On August 9, 1945, the same day Nagasaki was bombed, the Soviet Union invaded Manchuria in order to tie down any remaining Japanese soldiers that might be sent back to Japan. The Japanese, devoid of almost all fighting spirit, weren't able to hold off the Soviets, and on August 10th, the Japanese Prime Minister decided to accept the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. Imperial Japan surrendered to the Allied forces on August 15, 1945, after which Japan was occupied by America from 1945 until 1952, when the Treaty of San Francisco was signed, restoring peaceful relations between America and the nation of Japan, thus putting an official end to one of the most bloody, savage, and brutal war campaigns of all time. In total, 107,903 Americans were killed during the Pacific Campaign. The nationalist Chinese army is reported to have lost about 1.5 million men. Britain lost almost 30,000 men, and Australian losses were put at about 17,500. The worst losses were incurred by the Japanese. Over 2 million Japanese soldiers were killed in the process of trying to conquer and then defend the islands of the Southern Pacific. These numbers do not include the loss of civilian life during the war, and we haven't even touched on the war crimes committed during the Pacific Campaign. The Pacific Islands were home to some of the hardest fighting conditions in history. On these islands, young men fought and died for what they believed was right. Some were influenced by the ultra-nationalist idea that it was a great honor to die for their emperor, while others fought to stop the spread of anti-Western imperialism. The Pacific Campaign will go down as one of the most savage war campaigns of our time. We hope you enjoyed this video. If you'd like to see more of these videos, consider liking and subscribing. And if there were any inaccuracies you noticed, please let us know in the comments.